Okay, making decisions in Java using if statements, etc. There are a couple of ways of doing this. The main one that we're going to cover now is if statements, which can mean if else, and if else if else if else if as many times as necessary, and then else, or using a switch statement. So this is the way an if statement works. You can do it all in one line if you want to, but I would advise not to because it's not very clear, and this will only work if you're only doing one thing as a result of this condition being true. You see that? First of all, let's focus on the brackets. The condition that you put in to be met has to be covered in brackets, has to be surrounded in brackets, or else Java will complain and it won't let you compile. I would prefer if you wrote your if statement like this. So if inside the brackets you have your condition, then you open your curly braces and put in a series of commands, one or more commands, things that happen if it's true, and then you close your curly braces. In this presentation there are help buttons from this point onwards. This will link you directly to a tutorial about what this is talking about. Okay, so now a bit more complicated here. I've set x equal to 1, and I'm saying if x is less than 10, do these three things. That's fine, that will work absolutely fine. If I had not put in those red curly braces, then it would have done the second two things no matter what the value of x is, because the only line which depends on x being less than 10 would have been the first line. So that's why it's very important to have these curly braces at the start and at the end of your block in an if statement. Inside the condition, you can use all sorts of operators. Remember that a double equals is very different to a single equals. A double equals is comparing two things together, which is what you should be doing in an if. A single equals gives something a value. So it's a big error. If you say a single equals inside a brackets, Java will not warn you. Java will just make that variable equal to whatever value you put in there. Exclamation mark equal means not equal to. And you can join these together with ampersand to ampersand, which means and, or vertical line, which means or. Now the vertical line, the one I'm talking about, is directly above the backslash key on the right hand side of your Mac keyboard, below the delete key. So it's shift and backslash. Here's another option in your if statement. You can say if something is true, open your curly brackets, do whatever and close it, else, and open your curly brackets and close it again. And this gives two options. It either gives something to do if that's true and something to do if that's false. This is when there are only two possible options in a situation. This is what you would use. However, there may be three, there may even be more. So what you can do is you can have your condition, then what to do if it's true, and then else if, and another condition, and what to do if that's true. And if you wanted to, you could repeat this. You could say else if, and another condition, and what to do if that's true, else if, as many times as necessary. And the final one, if you want to, you can add an else with no condition in it, which is what will happen if none of the above prove to be true. So this has you covered if you want to do something with a lot of different possibilities. You can also have ifs within ifs, which makes it really important that you put these curly braces in. Generally, programmers try to avoid this, but in some conditions it can be very handy. For example, one of the ones that we may use this in, or might have used it in already, is in challenge number 10, in the rock, paper, scissors, where to optimize the choices, you may have put in an if within an if. For example, if the computer chooses rock, then within that, if the player chooses rock, within that, if the computer chooses paper, if the computer chooses scissors, and if the computer chooses rock, instead of doing all the possible combinations. So jumping back to this again. Okay, another warning that I would give you is use the curly braces appropriately if you can. Yeah, always count that you've opened and closed the same number of times in curly braces, and check that if you are doing a nested if, try and indent it correctly so you understand what's going on. Now, another thing is if you're using a string inside your condition, make sure that for a string you use dot equals instead of equals equals, because a string is not a primitive variable, and therefore you need to use one of its methods to check whether it's the same. Now we'll discover why a little bit later on, but very important. A lot of people say, you know, string 1 equals string 2, and that's not correct. It's not going to give you the right answer, and it's not going to give you an error when you compile it either, because it means something different that we'll discover later on when we do OOP. Okay, finally, string. The string class has lots of handy stuff in it. Here's a nice one. Equals ignore case will return true for these two strings, even though they've got different capitals and lowercase letters, which is quite handy. Final thing that you'll find very, very handy if you have a huge amount of options, and if they all depend on one simple primitive variable like this, is the switch statement. Switch statement starts off by inside the brackets you put what the condition is, simple condition, and you put a series of case statements and possibly a default at the very, very end. Each one has to have a break at the end of it. But can you see that if I had 100 different values of n and I wanted to do a different thing for each one, this would be a much neater way of laying out my code than doing it with if, else if, else if, else if, else if, else if 97 times. This will be much neater and much easier to understand. Remember, please, to put the break at the end of every line, because if, for example, 2 or 3 of these could be true for your variable. For example, if this case was less than 2, then and n was equal to 1, and you didn't put the break here, then it would do the first case, it would print out n is equal to 1, and then it would go on to evaluate the second case, which may be true as well, and it would print out n is equal to 2, which would be wrong.